pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. You've probably heard of the 7 deadly sins, right? They're this kind of ancient moral blueprint for personal vice. But what if that blueprint has been completely flipped on its head?
Yeah, let's just dive right into that provocative idea. What if the very things that were once seen as spiritual poisons are now, well, the essential fuel for our entire modern economic system? That's exactly what we're going to unpack here. And this right here, this is the core idea. The argument isn't that capitalism, invented greed or envy out of nowhere. Of course not. The point is that it took these ancient human failings and it built a system around them. It rewarded them. And in a lot of cases, it even relabeled them as freedom. So how on earth did we get here? Well, to really get this whole inversion thing, we first have to understand the original design. So let's rewind. Let's go way back to the beginning and see what these sins were actually supposed to be about. Okay, what's really fascinating is the original name, Vitia Capitalia. Now, the word capital here, nope, it has nothing to do with money. It comes from the Latin word caput, which means head. These were the head sins, the big ones, the sources, kind of like the fountains where all the other, smaller vices would flow from. And this whole concept took centuries to develop. It actually started back in the 4th century with a monk named Evagrius Ponticus. He listed 8 evil thoughts, which were basically psychological temptations. Then, a couple of centuries later, Pope Gregory the Great streamlined that list into the 7 we're familiar with. And then by the 13th century, the theologian Thomas Aquinas came along and gave them this really interesting frame. He called them disorders of love, basically misdirections of our natural human desires. So here's the crucial takeaway from all that history. The 7 deadly sins were never meant to be a list of the worst things you could possibly do. Think of them more like a diagnostic tool, a kind of spiritual chart for mapping out the internal battles of the human soul and figuring out the roots of our failings. And this is where we get to the main event, the critical pivot. We're about to shift from looking at sins as these personal internal struggles to sins as the literal operating principles of an external system. This is where everything gets turned upside down. So you have these 2 totally different ways of looking at sin. On one side, you've got the classic theological view. Sin is a personal failing, an internal temptation. It's a disorder of love. But on the other side, you've got this idea of structural sin, which comes from liberation theology. And here, sin isn't just in your head or your heart. It's a systemic function. It's baked into our policies and economic structures. It's not a disorder of love. It's the very engine of accumulation. So the argument goes like this. Capitalism itself starts to act like one of those original capital vices. Its core drives, like endless accumulation and extraction, they become the new head sins. And from them, all sorts of other wrongs start to flow. Everything from wage theft to ecological collapse. The system itself becomes the source of the problem. Okay, theory is great, but let's make this concrete. How does this systemic diagnosis actually play out in the real world? We're going to look at 4 key examples: pride, envy, greed, and sloth, to see exactly how this inversion works in practice. First up, the sin of pride. An inflated sense of your own self-worth. Well, in this new system, it gets a total rebrand. It's no longer a vice, it's a justification. So systemic pride is this ideology that your net worth is the ultimate measure of your personal worth. It takes things like luck and privilege and rewrites them into this grand story of personal virtue. It's what lets us build these glittering skyscrapers and call them visionary, while completely ignoring the actual human labor that put every single brick in place. It creates this hierarchy where success is seen as the self-made thing, not the outcome of a system. And that whole idea of this self-made hero leads us right into our next sin, envy. In the old moral playbook, envying what your neighbor had was, a spiritual poison. But in this new system, it's not a bug, it's a required feature. And the engine that runs on this envy? It's advertising. I mean, think about it. The entire purpose is to institutionalize envy. First, it manufactures discontent by constantly showing you everything you don't have. Then, it conveniently presents a product as the magic cure for that insecurity it just created. And the result? Endless consumption, very often fueled by debt. See, envy isn't some unfortunate side effect. It's literally the business model. All right, next up is the sin that probably needs the least introduction when we're talking about capitalism, greed. But here, it's not just a personal vice anymore. It's been transformed into the system's prime directive. Now, what's really wild is that this quote, this isn't from some radical critic. This is from Adam Smith, the guy who's often called the father of capitalism. He himself pointed out this vile maxim as the core motive of the economic elite. The system basically gives its blessing to what was once condemned. There's no such thing as enough. There's only this relentless, insatiable hunger for more growth, more accumulation forever. And for our last case study, let's tackle a sin you might not immediately link with a system that demands constant work: sloth. But here, sloth isn't about personal laziness. No, it's about institutional apathy. It's a systemic kind of laziness. And this really lays it out. The sloth of capitalism is all about what it chooses not to do. It neglects anything that isn't profitable. So, the system will just let public infrastructure crumble, but it will fund brand new prison construction. It'll let people go without healthcare, but quickly organize massive corporate bailouts. It abandons the commons, the things we all share and need, simply because there's no direct path to making a buck. It's a massive failure to do what is right, and it's born not from laziness, but from a cold, hard calculation about financial incentives. So, after going through this whole great inversion, where does that leave us? Let's try and pull all these threads together.
So here it is, the ultimate rebranding. Every sin we looked at, pride, envy, greed, sloth, it doesn't just get a pass, it gets reframed as a virtue. We call it ambition, aspiration, efficiency. These are just the new acceptable names for the old poisons. They've been transformed from personal failings into the very engines of the entire system. And that's the final takeaway. This profound ethical reversal. Those head sins, the generative vices that ancient theologians warned us would lead to ruin, have been completely rebranded. They are now the official, celebrated operating principles of the modern economy. And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question to chew on. If our system is built to not only tolerate, but to actively require and reward what we once called vice, then what's the real cost of trying to be a virtuous person within it?